The hum was wrong. Cale Dunmore knew it the way a man knows the sound of his own heartbeat, not through analysis or measurement, but through the accumulated weight of 30 years spent inside machines that didn't speak any language except vibration. He stood in Corridor 9 of the lower service ring, mop handle loose in his grip, dirty water cooling in the bucket at his feet, and he listened. Velindra Station's resonance core had been singing its deep, subaudible chord for as long as anyone alive could remember. It was the sound of the station itself being alive, gravity held steady, atmosphere circulated. The slow magnetic pulse that kept 2 million tons of crystal and steel in stable orbit above the Sarath homeworld, all balanced on that one unbroken note. Most people didn't hear it at all. They walked through it the way fish swim through water, unaware of the medium that sustained them. Cale heard nothing else. It was off by a quarter tone, maybe less, a shimmer in the subharmonic, like one instrument in a vast orchestra drifting flat by a fraction nobody in the audience would notice, nobody except the conductor, and nobody except a man who'd spent 3 decades with his hands on vibrating metal. He tilted his head the way he'd done 10,000 times in engine rooms across 4 star systems, and pressed his palm flat against the corridor wall. The vibration traveled through the alloy and into the bones of his hand, up his wrist, into the meat of his forearm. There it was, a wobble, faint as a moth's wing against glass, persistent as a toothache. Nobody was going to care what the janitor thought about it. He wrung out the mop, slopped it back into the bucket, and pushed it down the corridor. The wheels squeaked on the crystalline-laid floor, a small, familiar complaint he'd been meaning to grease for a week. Somewhere above him, 14 levels up, the Sarath Sovereignty's finest resonance engineers were about to start failing at the most important diagnostic of their careers. Cale didn't know this yet. He was mopping. The High Chamber of Applied Sciences convened its first emergency session at 1100 hours, station time. Chief Engineer Thales of the Calith Harmonic Institute, a man whose formal credentials took up 3 lines on official correspondence, and whose career had been built on the study of resonance structures, predating Sarath civilization by millennia, stood before a wall of holographic readouts, and told the assembled officials that every diagnostic metric was within nominal parameters. The officials looked at the readouts. They looked at each other. They looked at the faint ripple passing through the water in the crystal carafe on the conference table, a ripple that hadn't been there yesterday. If every metric is nominal, Empress Nalith said from the head of the table, her voice carrying the harmonic double tone all Sarath voices possessed, then explain why my station is vibrating. Thales did not have an explanation. His instruments said the core was fine. The core was not fine. This gap between what the instruments reported and what the station was doing would define the next 3 days. 14 levels below the high chamber, Cale finished Corridor 9, emptied his bucket into the service drain, refilled it from the supply tap, and started on Corridor 10. His shift ran 8 hours, 6 corridors per shift, 4 shifts per rotation cycle. The work was rhythmic, predictable. The kind of labor that freed the mind to do other things, which was both a gift and a curse for a man whose mind had been trained on Kolari-class drive cores, and whose hands remembered how to strip a turbine housing in the dark. The thing about maintenance work on a station this size was that it made you invisible. Cale had been on Velindra for 6 years, hired through a labor exchange program that matched displaced human workers with Sarath facilities too large and too menial labor-intensive to staff entirely with their own kind. Humans were cheap. Humans were durable. Humans didn't mind the small spaces or the chemical smells or the hours of repetitive physical work that the Sarath, with their aristocratic sensibilities and their long-fingered hands made for instruments and governance, found beneath their attention. So the exchange sent humans to mop floors, clear air vents, replace corroded seal strips in pressure doors, recalibrate environmental sensors, unjam disposal chutes, and perform the 1,000 small repairs that kept a station alive. Cale did all of this. He also quietly, without authorization, fixed things that weren't on his task list, a sticking pressure valve on sublevel 3 that the maintenance system hadn't flagged because it was still within tolerance but would fail within a month, a flickering environmental panel in corridor 14 that turned out to be a cold solder joint he repaired with a borrowed iron, and 5 minutes of concentration, a water reclamation pump whose bearings were developing the faint whine that meant they'd seize within 2 weeks. He did these things because they needed doing, and because the machines told him they needed doing, and because, after 30 years of listening, he couldn't walk past a machine in distress and pretend he hadn't heard it. Nobody noticed, nobody thanked him. The valve stopped sticking, the panel stopped flickering, the pump ran smooth. Things worked, and the reason they worked walked past in coveralls with a mop, and the Serath officials who moved through his corridors looked through him the way sunlight looks through glass. The Serath were tall, pale-skinned, beautiful in the way that architecture is beautiful, lavender complexions and luminous silver or white hair and eyes that caught light like cut amethyst. Their court functionaries moved through the service corridors in robes that cost more than Cale's annual contract, and their gaze passed over him without registering that a person occupied the space. Not malice, not contempt. Just a categorical certainty that the being in the coveralls was part of the infrastructure, serving a function but not possessing a presence worth acknowledging. He'd stopped minding years ago, or so he told himself on the mornings when the mop felt heavier than it should, and the memory of his hands on a drive core's housing surfaced like an old bruise pressed by accident. There had been a time when the work was different. He'd been 22 when he started on the Kolari-class freighters, running the inter-system trade routes, a junior engine tech, green as grass, hired because he was cheap and willing to crawl into turbine housings that the senior techs wouldn't fit inside. The senior engineer on the Halloway run, a woman named Lesta Voss who'd been doing engine work since before Cale's parents had met, had watched him strip his first fuel injector assembly and said, "You've got the hands." She'd meant it as a technical observation. His fingers found the right torque by feel. His palms read vibration the way other people read text fluently, instinctively, without translating. She taught him to listen. The rest he taught himself. Lesta had a philosophy about machines that Cale had absorbed without realizing it was a philosophy. "Every machine has a voice," she'd said, standing hip-deep in the Halloway's No. 3 turbine well, greased to her elbows, her silver-streaked hair tied back with a cable clip. "The voice tells you what it needs." Most people don't hear it because they're too busy looking at gauges. Gauges are summaries. Summaries leave things out. Put your hands on the machine and shut up and listen. She tapped the turbine housing with a wrench the way a doctor taps a chest. "What do you hear?" And Cale, 22 and terrified of getting the answer wrong, had closed his eyes and listened with his hands, and what he'd heard was a bearing running dry on the No. 7 injector, 2 millimeters of play in a shaft that should have been rigid. Lesta had nodded. "Good, now fix it. Don't wait for the gauge to catch up." Over the next 28 years, he'd worked his way through Kolari freighters and Meridian-class platforms and orbital shipyards, and one terrifying year on a salvage crew that recovered dead ships from drift lanes, where you learned more about how machines failed in a month than the academies taught in a decade. The salvage work had been the education that formal training couldn't provide. Every ship was a puzzle, broken in ways that defied the manual because the manual assumed maintenance had been performed, and dead ships were dead precisely because nobody had listened when the machine started talking. He'd pulled apart engines that had fused themselves, containment systems that had failed in cascades, environmental units that had compensated for one failure by creating 3 others. Each dead ship was a lesson in consequences. What happens when the wobble you ignored on Tuesday becomes the catastrophe you can't fix on Friday? He'd been a mechanic, an engine tech, a drive calibration specialist, a hull integrity auditor. He'd had his hands inside machines older than the civilizations that currently operated them. And then the trade routes had contracted, and the shipyards had automated, and the labor exchanges had started placing experienced human techs in whatever positions were available, which increasingly meant maintenance and sanitation on alien stations. The labor exchange officer who'd processed his placement on Velindra had glanced at his qualification record, 30 years compressed into a single-page summary that included drive core certifications, hull integrity ratings, and a salvage operations endorsement, and said, "Maintenance and sanitation, sublevel 4 through 8. Report to Administrator Valorn." Cale had looked at the posting and calculated the distance between what he was qualified to do and what he was being asked to do, and the calculation had come out to a number he didn't have a name for. Velindra had held him for 6 years, because the station itself was extraordinary. Even mopping the corridors, he could feel the resonance core's presence through the floor, a vast, ancient intelligence humming in the infrastructure, and some part of him that had been hungry for real machines. Since the last shipyard closed, its human contracts was fed just enough to stay. On this particular morning, the machines were saying something he didn't like. The wobble he'd felt in Corridor 9 was worse in Corridor 10. He could hear it now, a faint dissonance buried under the station's ambient hum, like a wrong note in a chord everyone had stopped listening to. He parked the mop and bucket against the wall and stood very still, eyes half closed, letting the sound fill his chest cavity. Years of engine work had taught him to use his ribcage as a resonance chamber. The bones amplified certain frequencies, dampened others. It was an imprecise instrument, but it didn't lie, and it didn't sample, and it didn't round. Phase drift. The core's primary harmonic was sliding out of alignment with its secondary, the way two tuning forks will start to beat against each other when one is fractionally detuned. It was slow, it was subtle, and it was going to get worse, because phase drift in crystal lattice structures didn't self-correct, it compounded, the way a small crack in a hull propagates under cyclic stress until the hull is no longer a hull but a collection of fragments held together by habit. Not his problem, he was the janitor. He finished Corridor 10. In Corridor 11, he paused to tighten a loose wall panel that had been vibrating in sympathy with the drift. In Corridor 12, he found a Serath harmonic chime, a crystal strand hung from a bracket as both art and diagnostic, swinging gently in air that should have been still. The chime was picking up the wobble. An engineering chime was supposed to hang motionless in properly balanced air. Its movement was the station's immune system raising a flag, and nobody was reading it. Cale steadied the chime with his hand, held it until the vibration damped out. Let go. It started swinging again within 10 seconds. He noted which direction the swing was stronger, toward the station's center, toward the core. He'd been noticing the chimes for months. Small movements he'd attributed to ventilation currents. Now he understood what they'd been telling him. In Corridor 13, he passed a Serath maintenance technician checking an environmental readout panel. The panel's numbers were telling a story the technician wasn't reading. Humidity variance had increased by 2%. A small number, but humidity variance was driven by air temperature, which was driven by the environmental systems, which drew their regulation signals from the station's central harmonics. A 2% shift meant the harmonic signal had a 2% wobble. The phase drift, speaking through a different system, telling the same story. Cale considered explaining the connection and decided against it. The technician would stare at him, note the coveralls, and return to his calibration sequence. He moved on. By midday, the Caliph team had run 27 separate diagnostic protocols, and everyone had returned green. Taylor stood on the primary observation platform in the core chamber and stared at readouts while the chamber walls trembled. The core hung at the center of the chamber, a crystalline structure the size of a 3-story building, suspended by magnetic containment fields that shimmered like heat haze. It was ancient. It was magnificent. For 1100 years the Serath had maintained it the way a temple maintains a relic, with reverence, ritual, and a carefully cultivated refusal to admit they didn't fully understand how it worked. The spectral analysis shows complete harmonic alignment. Rithia, his second-in-command and the team's crystallography specialist, reported. Primary at 7.3 cycles. Secondary at 7.3 cycles. No measurable deviation at any sampling resolution we can deploy. Subharmonic scan. Run 3 times. The subharmonics track the primary within specification. Heterodyne analysis. Done twice. No beat frequency above the noise floor. Thermal profile. Uniform. Containment field. Full rated capacity. No fluctuation. Then explain the vibration, Rithia. She couldn't. The Varanthi theorists, called in because their specialty was the oldest resonance structures in the known systems, stood on the secondary platform and offered hypotheses. Long-period crystal fatigue, microgravitational effects, the possibility that the core had entered a natural oscillation cycle the Sarath had never observed. None could be confirmed or falsified. The instruments agreed on everything and explained nothing. Thales dismissed the theorists and stood alone on the platform, watching the core pulse. He was a careful man, a thorough man. He had built his career on the principle that instruments, properly calibrated and properly deployed, would reveal any truth worth knowing. The possibility that this principle might be wrong, that the instruments might be incapable of seeing the problem, was not something he could easily accommodate. But he was also honest, and honesty required him to acknowledge that 3 days of work had produced nothing except a growing list of things the problem was not. He sent for the original construction schematics. They arrived as crystalline data tablets, their information stored in lattice patterns that required specialized readers. The schematics were incomplete. Sections had been lost. The core predated the sovereignty by centuries. The earliest records showed the Sarath finding it, not building it. The infrastructure had been built around an artifact whose full specifications were unknown. Thales ran his hand along the platform railing and felt the vibration in his fingers. It felt like a heartbeat with an extra beat. Cale ate his lunch in the maintenance bay on sublevel for a small room with exposed conduit, a bench that doubled as a shelf for cleaning supplies, and a ventilation fan that rattled once every 12 seconds. He ate alone. There were other human workers on the station, 11 of them, spread across shifts and sublevels. Goran, who handled waste processing and had a talent for fixing disposal chutes that went beyond his job description. Mirren, who cleaned the residential corridors and sometimes left a protein bar on Kale's bench when she noticed he'd worked through lunch. Deck, who ran ventilation maintenance and operated an informal repair service for the other human workers' personal equipment, charging nothing, doing it because idle hands bothered him more than unpaid labor. They'd formed the kind of community that grows among people who share a condition, not friends exactly, but allies in invisibility. They met in the service corridors between shifts, traded information about which sublevels had faulty climate control and which administrators were running spot checks. Goran had a dry humor that surfaced in observations like, cleaned the same corridor twice today because 2 different supervisors entered it into the system. Efficiency. Mirren worried about everyone quietly and expressed it through protein bars and notes left on benches. Deck had an encyclopedic knowledge of station infrastructure that he'd assembled from 6 years of crawling through ventilation ducts and reading whatever signage and labels he encountered. Kale's lunch was a protein bar and a thermos of coffee brewed on a heating coil he'd repaired himself when the original element burned out. The vibration was in the bench now, traveling up through his spine. He could feel it in his hip joints. He pulled his frequency wrench from his belt. The wrench was old, bought from a salvage yard on Meridian Station for 12 credits when he was 23. Lesta had been with him. She'd picked it up, turned it over, tested the calibration dial with her thumb. Analog sensor, she'd said. Continuous reading. None of this sampling interval garbage. Buy it, he'd bought it. The housing was scratched now. The calibration dial worn smooth where his thumb had rubbed it across 3 decades and 4-star systems. But it read vibrations with an analog sensor that listened continuously, and its readout didn't lie. He held it against the wall. Primary harmonic, 7.3 cycles. Secondary, 7.3 cycles. Nominal. Except it wasn't. He knew what 7.3 against 7.3 sounded like: silence, perfect unison. What he was hearing was a beat frequency, a rhythmic pulsing that meant the 2 notes were close but not identical. The wrench's display couldn't show the discrepancy because it only resolved to 1 decimal place. But the discrepancy was there somewhere in the 4th decimal, 7.3 against 7.2997 perhaps. Too small for the display. Not too small for the core. Because the core didn't sample. The core was analog, continuous, alive in the way old machines are alive. A discrepancy in the 4th decimal place, given enough time, would compound. The beat frequency would strengthen. The core would try to compensate, pouring more energy into the containment field, and eventually the compensation would exceed capacity, and 2 million tons of station would begin to shake apart. Cale put the wrench away, finished his coffee. The problem turned in his mind like a machine he was disassembling methodically, 1 component at a time, looking for the part that didn't fit. He knew what was wrong. He knew how to fix it. Nobody was going to ask him. He went back to mopping. That evening, in his quarters on sublevel, ate a cabin barely wider than his outstretched arms, with a bunk, a shelf, and a small porthole that looked out onto the station's structural framework. He sat on the edge of the mattress and held the wrench against the wall. The vibration was in everything now. The toothbrush in the holder on the shelf, the water in the glass on the floor beside his bunk, the frame of the bunk itself, humming a frequency that had no business being there. He thought about Lesta Voss. She'd retired 3 years before the trade routes collapsed, which meant she'd gotten out while the getting was good. Last he'd heard, she was living on a ground-side settlement, probably growing something in a garden, probably talking to her plants the way she'd talked to engines. She would have known what to do on Velindra. She would have walked into the engineering bay, ignored every credential and protocol, and put her hands on the core. That was the difference between Lesta and everyone else. She never asked permission to listen. He pulled his maintenance log toward him, a physical notebook, paper, pages, pencil. He'd kept one on every ship and station he'd ever worked on. The digital logs were official. The paper log was real. He wrote, Day 1. Subharmonic phase drift detected in Velindra resonance core. Estimated 4th decimal deviation between primary and secondary coupling harmonics. Standard digital instrumentation likely unable to resolve. Drift is compounding. Recommend analog diagnostic of coupling array, lower south quadrant. See Dunmore, maintenance, sublevel 48. Nobody would read it, but the record existed. Lesta had taught him that too. Write it down, even if nobody reads it. The machine knows what's wrong. You know what's wrong. If nobody listens and it breaks, at least the record shows that someone knew. He slept poorly. The vibration followed him into his dreams, not as sound but as texture, the feeling of a machine running wrong, the particular wrongness that lives in the space between what something is doing and what it should be doing. He'd had these dreams before, on the salvage ships, sleeping in the bunks of dead crews, dreaming the vibrations those crews had ignored. He ran into Goran at the service lift the next morning. Goran was hauling a cart of waste processing filters, his coveralls marked with the particular stains that came from working near the station's biological recycling systems. Goran tilted his head toward the ceiling. You feel that? I feel it. Getting worse. The disposal chute on sublevel 6 jammed twice yesterday, timing motors cycling off rhythm. Never done that before. It's the core. The timing signal for every automated system on this station comes from the core's harmonic. If the harmonic wobbles, every downstream system wobbles with it. You know what it is, don't you? I have an idea. Tell anyone. Told Valorn. Goran snorted, a sound that contained a complete assessment of the likelihood that Valorn would act on information from a janitor. Should tell someone who matters. Everyone I could tell would ask me why a janitor has an opinion about resonance engineering. Same answer every time. The coveralls. The coveralls. The service lift arrived. They rode it in silence, the car vibrating faintly, the display panel flickering every few seconds as the timing signal that drove it stuttered. The next morning, the station shuddered. Brief 2 seconds, maybe 3, but on a structure that hadn't shuddered in living Serath memory, it was catastrophic in its implications. Every conversation stopped. Every transaction paused. Crystal shattered somewhere above a decorative panel, probably, one of the artistic installations in the upper galleries that existed because the station's builders had assumed the harmonic environment would remain perfect forever. The ambient hum resumed, and it was worse. The dissonance was plainly audible now, a low pulsing that vibrated in teeth and fingertips and the fluid of the inner ear. Kale was in the filtration bay on sublevel 5, replacing a corroded gasket when the shutter hit. He grabbed the edge of the reclamation unit and held on. The tools on his belt swung. His coffee thermos, balanced on the edge of the unit, fell and clattered on the deck. When it passed, he stood for a moment feeling the station's distress in every surface his hands touched. The reclamation pump was running rough, its drive motor cycling with a subtle arrhythmia because the pump's timing signal was drawn from the station's central harmonics, and the harmonics were no longer keeping steady time. He could fix the gasket. He could fix the pump. He could walk through every corridor and fix every small failure the drift was causing. But the failures would keep coming because the source was still running wrong, in a chamber he'd never been authorized to enter, surrounded by engineers who couldn't hear it. He put the gasket down, cleaned his hands on his coveralls, took the service lift to sublevel 2 to find Administrator Valorn. Valorn was a mid-level facilities administrator who managed the human labor contracts for sublevels 1 through 8. His office was precisely organized, every data tablet aligned, every surface clean. He was efficient, not unkind. He had a talent for conducting conversations with humans while looking at a point slightly to the left of their heads, as though the human were a data readout and the interesting information was in the adjacent column. "The core," Kale said. "The core is being addressed by the high chamber's engineering specialists. It is not a maintenance concern. It's a phase drift in the subharmonic coupling. The primary and secondary are sliding out of alignment at the 4th decimal place. Your engineer's instruments can't resolve it because they sample at intervals, and the drift is happening between the intervals. It's like trying to photograph a spinning wheel with a slow shutter. The wheel looks stationary because the camera only catches it at certain positions. The drift is happening between the shutter clicks." Valorn's gaze moved from Kale's shoulder to Kale's face. It arrived with the slow surprise of a man discovering that a piece of furniture has spoken. "The core sings a chord, 2 notes. Those 2 notes need to be exactly the same frequency. They're not anymore. The difference is too small for digital instruments because they take snapshots and report averages. The drift falls through the gaps, but the core doesn't measure in gaps. The core is analog. It listens all the time, and what it's hearing is itself going out of tune." "You are the janitor for sublevels 4 through 8. "Yes." "Resonance engineering requires 17 years of formal study at the Calith Harmonic Institute." "I know, I'm not a resonance engineer. I'm a man who spent 30 years with his hands on machines. I'm telling you what I hear." Valorn's expression completed its journey to polite dismissal. "I will note your observation in my daily report. Please return to your assigned duties." Kale walked out and stood in the corridor. He pressed his palm against the wall and felt the wobble accelerating beneath his hand, and he thought about what it meant to know something that nobody would let you say. He thought about Lesta Voss, who would have walked into the engine room and fixed the problem without asking permission. But Lesta Voss had been the senior engineer. She had the rank, the access, the authority. Cale had a mop and a title that meant invisible. He went back to his duties, finished the gasket, mopped corridors, replaced a faulty pressure sensor. The seal's readings had been drifting high, 3% above true. The station was flexing. The seal knew. He cleared a condensation buildup caused by microfractured thermal insulation, another vibration symptom. He patched a hairline crack in a coolant pipe along a weld seam, exactly where cyclic vibration stress would concentrate. He did all of this quietly, without reporting it, because the maintenance system didn't track what it didn't ask for, and because by now the habit of fixing things nobody knew he was fixing was so deeply embedded in the way he worked that it felt less like a choice and more like a reflex. By mid-afternoon, the military structural assessment team had completed its analysis. The station's structure was sound for now, but stress patterns consistent with prolonged low-frequency vibration were developing along the primary load-bearing members. If the vibration continued at its current rate of increase, structural tolerances would be exceeded within approximately 72 hours. Below that threshold, the crystal lattice members that formed Velindra's skeleton would begin to fracture. The station would not explode. It would simply come apart, slowly, the way a bridge comes apart when the resonance finds its natural frequency, and the oscillations exceed the material's ability to absorb them. 72 hours, the Empress said when she received the assessment. At current rate, Your Eminence, we recommend controlled evacuation of non-essential personnel. The Empress turned to Thales, chief engineer. We have run every diagnostic available to us. The core reads nominal across every parameter. I cannot fix what I cannot find. Then find it differently. I don't know what differently looks like, Your Eminence. We have exhausted our diagnostic repertoire. Every instrument, every protocol, every theoretical framework available to Caliph-trained engineers has been applied. The core reads healthy. The station is shaking. I have no explanation for the contradiction. The instruments are wrong. The sentence hung in the air. Thales did not answer it. He had given his professional life to the instruments. They were the foundation of everything he knew. But a doubt had taken root. He'd felt the vibration in his bones on the platform. Something was wrong. His instruments said otherwise. For the first time in 34 years of practice, he wondered whether his instruments were asking the right questions. He returned to the core chamber and ran the diagnostics again, and again, and again. Each time the green lights mocked him. 14 levels below, Cale mopped corridor 16. The water in his bucket trembled with a rhythm that matched the pulse in the walls. Faster now. The drift was accelerating. He mopped methodically and thought about what would happen when the tolerance ran out. He thought about the 2 million people on this station, and the fact that he knew what was killing it and the distance between knowing and being heard. The second shudder hit at 1600 hours. Longer this time. 4 seconds. 5. The high chamber's crystal table cracked along its center seam with a sound like a bell being struck wrong. Something structural groaned in the deep infrastructure, a load-bearing member flexing beyond its design envelope, protesting in a voice only the structure itself could produce. Emergency lighting activated in 6 sublevels. 3 pressure doors sealed automatically, their sensors registering the microflexion as a potential hull breach. Cale was cleaning the observation gallery on level 12 when it hit. He grabbed the railing. His bucket tipped, sending cleaning solution across the crystal floor in a slow wave. When the shudder passed, the solution was still rippling, and in the ripples he could see the beat frequency, regular, rhythmic, visible now in liquid, a pattern as clear as a pulse on a monitor. He wasn't alone. Empress Nalith stood at the far end of the gallery, one hand on the railing, the other pressed flat against the viewport glass. Her lavender skin had paled at the edges. Her silver hair, usually arranged in precise geometric patterns, showed the disarrangement of a woman who had been running between briefings for 3 days. "You are the maintenance worker," she said. "Yes, Your Eminence. You spoke to Administrator Valorn about the core." I told him what I heard. He labeled it unsolicited observation from non-technical staff. A single line in a daily report I would not normally read. I read it because I am reading everything now, and I noticed that his non-technical staff used terminology my technical staff has not. Phase drift in the subharmonic coupling, fourth decimal discrepancy. These are not a janitor's words. They're an engine tech's words. Before I was a janitor, I was other things. What other things? 30 years of other things. Kolari-class freighter engines, orbital platform hull integrity, turbine calibration on the Halloway run, drive core maintenance on Meridian Station, salvage yard diagnostics, where you learn more in a month than the Institute teaches in a year because the machines are broken in ways nobody's written a manual for. I listen to machines, Your Eminence. I've always listened. It's the only thing I do well. And what do you hear now? I hear a core that's dying by inches because the space between your instrument's measurements is where the problem lives. And nobody's looking there because nobody's instruments can see into that space. Your digital systems sample the core's harmonic at fixed intervals and report the average. The drift is smaller than the interval. It falls through the cracks. The core knows it's there. Your instruments don't. The Empress was quiet for a long moment. Below them, through the viewport, the Sarath homeworld turned in its orbit, violet continents and silver oceans catching the light of a pale blue star. He watched her think the fractional narrowing of the faceted eyes, the stillness that was not passivity but processing. She was deciding whether to trust a janitor's diagnosis over her chief engineer's instruments. "Come with me," she said. She walked him through 16 security doors, 2 radiation barriers, a biometric checkpoint that had to be manually overridden by her personal authorization. At each checkpoint, officials stared at the human janitor in stained coveralls walking behind the Empress of the Sarath sovereignty. Their expressions traveled through confusion and disbelief and arrived at the practiced Sarath discipline of showing nothing. The core chamber opened before them. The core hung in the center of the space, translucent crystal shot through with veins of pale blue light, pulsing in slow waves, suspended by containment fields that shimmered like heat haze. The sound was enormous, not loud, but deep, pervasive, a physical force that pressed against his chest and vibrated in his jaw. He'd heard it for 6 years through 14 levels of crystal and steel. Standing in its presence was like meeting a voice that had been singing to you through a wall, and discovering that the voice belongs to something vast and ancient and alive. And it was wrong. Up close, the wrongness was unmistakable. The beat frequency was a pulse here, a rhythmic throbbing in the crystal's light, in the containment field's shimmer, in the air itself. The core was fighting itself. 23 engineers on platforms at 3 levels looked up when the Empress entered with a human in maintenance coveralls. They looked at Kale the way people look at a typographical error in a formal document, puzzled, faintly offended by its presence in a context where it didn't belong. "This is the maintenance worker I mentioned. He will examine the core." Thales descended from the primary platform. He looked at Kale with the careful assessment of a man, told that help is coming and realizing it's wearing coveralls and carrying a frequency wrench that was old when Thales was in graduate school. "Your Eminence, the core is a class prime pre-sovereignty artifact. The protocols for physical access are—" "I know the protocols, Chief Engineer. I also know that your protocols have not identified the problem in 3 days. The station has 72 hours. Let him look." Kale walked to the platform railing. He pulled the frequency wrench from his belt, thumbed it on, held it toward the core. The display scrolled, 7.3 against 7.3, nominal. He turned the wrench off and put it back on his belt, the tool that had been with him for 22 years, through freighters and platforms and shipyards, the one constant in a career that had contracted until it fit inside a janitor's coveralls. Even the wrench's analog sensor couldn't resolve the fourth decimal, but his hands could. He closed his eyes. The sound filled him the way water fills a vessel. He could hear the primary harmonic, the deep foundational tone that had been singing since before the Seraph built their first city on the world below. He could hear the secondary, the higher interlocking note that created the composite chord the station depended on. He could hear the ghost harmonics, the interference patterns, the subtle overtones that gave the core its particular voice, its identity, as individual as a fingerprint or a human heartbeat. And he could hear the drift. There, in the space between the primary and the secondary, where two notes that should have been one were not quite meeting. A gap no instrument could measure and no engineer could ignore if they could hear it. There, he said, eyes still closed, pointing down and to the left. The secondary coupling array, lower south quadrant. The crystal at that junction is oscillating fractionally below the primary. Your instruments read the coupling through a digital sampling layer that was retrofitted 600 years ago. The drift is smaller than the sampling interval. It falls through the gaps between measurements, but the core feels it continuously because the core is analog. It was built analog. Your digital overlay is blind to what's happening underneath it. And the fix? Thales asked. His voice was stripped of everything except the need to know. The analog controls, manual adjustment dials in the coupling array housing, physical crystal dials, 9 of them installed by the original builders. Your digital overlay was added on top of the original analog interface. The dials are still there. There in the pre-digital mechanical schematics maintenance archive, sublevel 2, filed under legacy infrastructure. They bypass the sampling layer entirely. They speak the core's language. Thales looked at Rithia. The Varanthi theorists looked at each other with the expression of people, told the answer has been sitting in a filing cabinet for 600 years. I was not aware maintenance staff had access to historical technical archives, Thales said. They don't formally. I read them on my own time. The archive is open to anyone with a station badge. Nobody else was interested. Rithia began pulling up the pre-digital architecture files on her personal tablet. The analog interface layer, she murmured, scrolling through schematics that hadn't been accessed in decades. It's all here. The coupling array, the manual calibration points, the resonance feedback loops completely independent of the digital overlay. We built our entire monitoring system on top of this, and then forgot it existed. You didn't forget, Cale said. You graduated past it. The digital system works better for routine monitoring. Faster, cleaner, more precise in the decimal places it can see. It just can't see what's happening now because this problem lives in a space your digital system was designed to average away. Show me, Thales said. The words cost him something. Cale could see it in the set of the man's jaw, in the controlled steadiness of his breathing. But Thales said it, and that told Cale the kind of engineer he was, the kind that cared more about the answer than about who provided it. They cleared the lower south platform. Thales himself opened the access panel on the coupling array housing, a curved crystal shell that hadn't been opened in recorded memory. Behind it, a curved crystal panel covered in centuries of accumulated dust. 9 dials, each a precisely machined crystal disc the size of Cale's palm, each controlling a different facet of the coupling's resonance output. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Whoever had built these dials had built them to last longer than the civilization that would inherit them. Cale knelt before the panel and blew the dust away. It scattered in the containment field's shimmer, catching blue light like tiny stars. He placed his hand flat on the crystal surface surrounding the dials. The vibration hit him total, immediate, filling his hand and arm and chest. This close, there was no ambiguity. The drift was real, accelerating, and the core was spending energy it couldn't afford trying to compensate for a deviation it couldn't correct through its own feedback systems. "I need silence," he said. "No instruments running, no holograms, no data feeds. I need to hear the core and nothing else." Thales hesitated. Shutting down instruments in the middle of an emergency was counterintuitive, but he'd been running instruments for 3 days and they'd told him nothing. He gave the order. One by one, the holographic displays winked out. The instrument banks went dark. The humming of active scanners ceased. The chamber filled with the core's voice, unaccompanied, unfiltered, raw. It was the most honest sound Cale had heard since the last time he'd put his ear against a drive core, housing on the Holloway run, and listened for the whisper of a bearing going dry. He started with the first dial. It resisted for a fraction of a second 600 years of stillness, then turned with smooth precision that spoke to manufacturing tolerances far beyond current Serath capability. The core's sound shifted. Not better, not worse, different. A new relationship between the variables. The second dial, the third, the fourth, each one affected all the others in a web of interdependencies that would have taken a computational model months to map. Cale didn't calculate, he listened. The vibrations traveled through his hands and his knees and his chest and his teeth, and he turned the dials the way a man tunes a machine he's loved all his life by feel, by the accumulated memory of 10,000 adjustments on 10,000 machines, by the instinct that Lester Voss had recognized in a 22-year-old kid and called the hands. The fifth dial was the pivot. When he turned it, the dissonance worsened, the beat frequency strengthened, the chamber walls trembled visibly, and behind him someone made a sharp intake of breath. One of the younger engineers stepped forward instinctively, and Thales held up a hand to stop her. Cale held the dial steady and listened through the worsening to the correct frequency hiding behind the wrong one, the way a musician hears the right note hiding behind a detuned string. The inflection point was there, the narrow band where the fifth dial's contribution crossed from amplifying the drift to counteracting it. He found it, locked it. The worsening reversed like a tide turning. The sixth dial. Finer adjustments now. The calibration narrowing toward something he could feel but not name, a rightness that existed below the level of measurement, in the space where machines and the people who understand them share a language that has no words. He hummed while he worked, a low, steady tone pitched to the frequency he was chasing. Something he'd always done since Lester Voss first heard him humming in the number 3 turbine well and said, "Good, keep that. The machine can hear you too." The sound was small in the vast chamber, a man humming at his work, the most ordinary sound in the world, except that in this place, with 23 engineers watching in the dark and an empress standing silent above, the sound of a man humming while he worked was the most important sound on Velindra Station. The seventh dial, the eighth, each adjustment smaller, finer, the precision increasing as the target narrowed. The ninth dial clicked under his thumb. The sound changed, not louder, not quieter, clean. The harmonic locked into itself like a bone returning to its socket, like a key turning in a lock it was made for. The beat frequency vanished. What remained was a sound so pure and so right that it pressed against the inside of Cale's chest. And for a moment he couldn't breathe because the beauty of it existed the way gravity exists, indifferent to whether anyone notices, present regardless. "That's it," he said. His voice was quiet, rough at the edges, the voice of a man surfacing from a deep dive. The core pulsed. A single deep throb of blue-white light traveled through the crystal lattice, and the entire station responded not with a shudder but with a settling, a vast structural exhalation, 2 million tons releasing a tension they'd been holding for days. The hum that followed was the hum Velindra Station was born to make. Clean, true, stable, the sound of a machine at peace with itself. One of the Varanthi theorists sat down on the platform and put her face in her hands. Thales stood motionless, his expression unreadable. Rithia stared at her monitor. She'd reactivated just the one at two frequency lines, primary and secondary, that now overlapped so precisely they appeared as one. How did he calibrate without reference data, she said, to no one in particular. The original specifications are lost. Every record of the core's baseline harmonic was destroyed in the third archive collapse. He matched a 4,000-year-old standard by ear. He matched it by feel, Taylor said quietly. That's different and possibly more accurate. Cale stood up. His knees protested, 47 years old and kneeling on crystal for 20 minutes. His back made its opinion known. His face held the expression none of the engineers could read. The quiet satisfaction of a man who has done the one thing he is best at, after years of being forbidden the opportunity by the shape of his uniform. It was the sampling gap, he said, brushing dust from his coveralls. Your digital layer samples at fixed intervals. The drift was happening between samples. Every diagnostic was technically correct at the moment of sampling, but between samples the coupling was oscillating. The core felt every oscillation. Your instruments averaged them away. The analog dials don't sample. They read continuously. That's why your instrument said green while the core said help. The Empress looked at him from the upper platform. Thank you, she said. Two words that landed on Cale with the weight of something he hadn't known. He needed not gratitude exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that he existed, that what he knew mattered. Just maintenance, he said. Same as the floors, you listen, you find what's wrong, you fix it, the scale changes, the work doesn't. He walked back across the platform, past engineers who stepped aside without being asked, past Taylors who inclined his head, the seraph gesture of formal respect between equals. At the archway leading out of the chamber, he paused. You'll want to check the analog interface every 90 days. The crystal dials hold their setting, but the mounting substrate flexes with temperature cycling over time. A quarterly inspection, physical, not digital, hands on the panel, will catch any drift before it compounds. I'll write up the procedure if you want. I want, Taylor said. Then Cale walked out, through the 16 security doors and the radiation barriers and the biometric checkpoint where the guard inclined her head to him, a small gesture. The first time a guard above sublevel 8 had acknowledged his existence in 6 years. Back to the service corridors where his mop and bucket were waiting exactly where he'd left them. He picked them up. He refilled the bucket. And he went back to work, because the corridors still needed mopping, and the work didn't stop being necessary just because he'd done something else. Over the following week, Cale went back to his corridors. He mopped sublevel 4. He replaced the pressure sensor on sublevel 7 with the core retuned. The readings had dropped back to true, the 3% drift corrected without anyone touching the sensor itself. He cleared a clogged ventilation duct that Deck had flagged for him. He checked every harmonic chime he could find. They were all hanging still now, motionless in balanced air, keeping the silence they were designed to keep. The station was breathing easily again. Mirren left a protein bar on his bench with a note in her careful handwriting. Heard you fixed something important. Good. That was all. The people who did the work recognized each other. They didn't need ceremonies. Taylors came to the maintenance bay on the 3rd day. He stood in the doorway and looked at the exposed conduit, the cleaning supplies, the bench with its coffee ring stains. He looked at the room the way you look at a place you've just learned matters more than you thought. I've read the pre-digital schematics, he said. I've spent the last 2 days in the archive on sublevel 2. I've been studying resonance engineering for 34 years, and I did not know those schematics existed. They were in the maintenance archive, open access. Sublevel 2, Section 9, Cabinet 47. Any station badge unlocks it. I've also been reviewing your maintenance logs, the official digital ones. You've been filing repair notices for equipment our monitoring systems haven't flagged yet. Pressure seals, insulation fractures, weld stress patterns. Going back years, You've been seeing failures before they happen. I've been listening to machines. They tell you what's coming if you listen. That is the thing we train for 17 years at the Caliph Harmonic Institute and do not always achieve. He inclined his head again, the same formal gesture. I would be honored if you would consult with my team on the ongoing maintenance of the analog systems, not as a subordinate, as a colleague. I appreciate that. I'll listen to the core. I'll tell you what I hear. Beyond that, your team knows its work. They just need to remember the tools that came before the tools they know. Thales considered this, inclined his head a third time, left. Administrator Valorn sent for him on the 5th day. His office was the same, data tablets aligned, surfaces clean. But Valorn looked at Kale's face the entire time, not at a point to the left, not at the wall behind him, at him. The Empress has ordered your access clearance extended to all station levels without restriction. This includes the core chamber, the engineering sublevels, the archival vaults, and the residential rings. She has ordered a direct communication channel established between your maintenance terminal and the engineering oversight board. Chief Engineer Thales has recommended you for a formal position, Core Resonance Auditor, a title, an office, a salary commensurate with senior engineering staff. I know. What is your answer? I'll think about it. Valorn waited. Kale let him wait. I don't need the title, Kale said. The title doesn't change what I hear. It doesn't change the work. It changes what other people call me while I'm doing it, and I've spent 6 years learning that what people call me doesn't affect whether the work gets done. The Empress would prefer a formal answer. Then tell her I said yes to the access and no to the title. I'll listen to the core. I'll check the analog interface on her 90-day schedule. I'll write up the procedure for Thales' team. But I'll do it as the janitor, because the janitor is who showed up when the station was shaking, and the janitor is who I was when I heard what nobody else could hear. Valorn looked at him. Something shifted behind his eyes, the machinery of assumption adjusting, recalibrating, the way a pressure sensor adjusts when the true reading replaces the drifted one. I will convey your response, Valorn said. He paused, and Dunmore. Yes. Thank you for telling me, even when I didn't listen. You listened, you just didn't hear. There's a difference, and it's not always your fault. On the 7th day, the Empress came to the observation gallery. Kale was cleaning the crystal viewport panels, as he did every 4th rotation cycle. His cloth moved in steady arcs across the surface, removing the faint film that accumulated from the station's atmosphere systems. Below, the Serath homeworld turned in its orbit, violet and silver. You could have told someone sooner, she said, someone who would have listened. I told the person I had access to. That's how systems work. Information travels through channels. My channel was Valorn. Valorn's channel was a daily report nobody reads unless the station is falling apart. That is a failure of our system. It's a failure of every system. People see the uniform. The uniform tells them what to expect. They don't look past it because looking past it means their expectations might be wrong, and wrong expectations mean the system they trust is incomplete. Nobody wants the system to be incomplete. And yet it was. It always is. That's not a flaw, that's a feature. The system handles the things it can handle. The things it can't handle require a person standing in the gap, doing the work the system doesn't know needs doing. Every station has someone like me. Every ship, every facility. The person who fixes what isn't broken yet. They're invisible because the system doesn't have a category for what they do. The Empress turned from the viewport to look at him directly. Her faceted eyes caught the light from the homeworld below, refracting it into shades of violet and silver. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at the core readings, carefully, completely, without flinching from what she saw. I offered you a title. You declined. I declined the title, not the work. Then what do you want, Kale Dunmore? He set the cleaning cloth down on the railing, thought about it the way he thought about machines practically, without sentiment, looking for the answer that fit. Access. Let me walk the whole station the way I walk my corridors, the core, the containment systems, the old analog infrastructure underneath the digital layer. Let me listen to all of it, not as an auditor, not with a rank, just let me do what I do. As the janitor. As the janitor who listens. Something moved across the Empress's face. Not a smile. The Seraph didn't smile the way humans didn't have the same muscle configuration for it. But the nearest equivalent, a softening around the eyes, a warmth in the geometric set of her features, a recognition that traveled from the surface inward. I will instruct Valorn to extend your access without restriction. You will report anomalies directly to the Oversight Board. You will continue your maintenance duties as you see fit. That's all I need. And Kale. He met her gaze. The distance between them, Empress and Janitor, Seraph and human, the ruler of a sovereignty and the man who mopped its floors, held steady for a moment, then collapsed into something simpler. One person seeing another, really seeing them, past the coveralls and the robes, past the protocols and the assumptions that calcify around a life the way mineral deposits calcify around a pipe. Next time you hear something wrong, tell me, not Valorn, me. He almost smiled. I told someone in the first hour, he sent me back to mop. The next time, you have a different channel. She held his eyes for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked away, her robes trailing soft light across the crystal floor he'd just cleaned. Kale watched her go, picked up his cloth, went back to the panels. The work didn't stop because someone had finally seen him doing it. The station hummed around him, clean and true, and Kale Dunmore, janitor, mechanic, engine tech. The man who listened hummed quietly with it, matching the pitch the way he'd always done, the way Lester Voss had told him to do 30 years ago in a turbine well on the Holloway run. That evening he sat in the maintenance bay, coffee in the thermos, wrench on the bench beside him. The room was quiet. The ventilation fan turned smoothly, he'd balanced it last week. The bench hummed beneath him, but it was the right hum now, the hum the station was supposed to make, the sound of 2 million tons in equilibrium. He pressed the wrench to the wall one more time. 7.3 against 7.3. Nominal. The display was still rounding, still sampling, still averaging. But the truth underneath was sound because he'd set it right with his hands and his ears and 30 years of work that nobody had asked about until the station shook, and a man with a mop turned out to be the only one listening. He put the wrench away, drank his coffee, rinsed the thermos, hung it on its hook. Tomorrow there would be corridors to mop and seals to check, and an ancient resonance core to listen to. There would be the work that was assigned and the work that mattered, and for the first time in 6 years, they would be the same thing. He turned off the light. Through the walls of Velindra Station, the core sang its deep and perfect chord, and the harmonic chimes hung motionless in the balanced air, and 2 million tons of crystal and steel orbited in the equilibrium one man's hands had restored, and Kale Dunmore listened to it all the way home.